Israel's favorability rating among Americans, just sort of, do you like Israel? How do you feel about Israel? 74% of Americans have favorable views of Israel, and that's large majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. So it's important not to use views of the conflict as a proxy for views of Israel, all in a broader sense. But Americans do support Israel and a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. And at the policy level, the bilateral relationship is both deep and broad in all the ways that have been described: trade, military, intelligence cooperation, technological partnerships, and so on. And we are examining and indeed celebrating a number of those dimensions over the course of these 2 days. And over 3/4 of Americans of all political stripes see Israel as an important ally, right behind Britain and Australia and Canada, and as a strategic asset to the United States. But the strength of this bilateral relationship is not just about interests, and it's not just about domestic political constituencies. It is about shared values, and both Israelis and Americans, not just at the level of political leadership, but in public opinion surveys and other instruments, exhibit a view that shared values of democracy and pluralism are a core component of this U.S.-Israel relationship. And shared values are an important factor also in Americans' support for Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well. And that values component, that shared values component, is actually more important to independents and to Democrats than it is to Republicans in the surveys. So just to give you an example, most Americans think that the U.S. shouldn't lean toward either side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That's the majority view. But among Americans who think that the U.S. should lean toward Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the main reason why is shared values. The importance that Americans ascribe to democratic values is also evident in their views of how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might be resolved. We were talking at the beginning of the day today about Israel's Jewishness and its democracy and the tension that emerges between these two. And large majorities of Americans see a two-state outcome as the best outcome, their preferred outcome, just as is still true for a bare majority of Israelis and a bare majority of Palestinians. But if two states are no longer possible, a large majority of Americans say that they prioritize Israel's democracy over its Jewishness, and so if there's no two-state solution, they prefer one state with equal rights. That's 71% of Americans overall, including 60% of Republicans. So the sense of democratic values as being important in the relationship, certainly important to Americans, is something that's very broadly held. And given this background, the rise of this sort of exclusionary nationalist politics, the indicators of democratic recession that Naomi Chazan was talking about, are worth considering, because we should expect these trends to impact the bilateral relationship. And this is true, by the way, whether or not these populist politics we've been talking about present an existential challenge to democracy. Even if they don't ultimately fundamentally challenge democracy, they might still reshape the way we think about each other and talk about each other and interact. So the question is how? Not just why the U.S.-Israel relationship has been politicized, which we often talk about in partisan terms, but in what way? What's changed? Why is it that Israeli politicians see it as in their interest to do the things Bob described them doing? Or why is it that it's in President Trump's interest to do the things we've seen him do? And I would argue that the rise of this kind of nationalist politics, the challenges to democratic health, are changing the character of this bilateral relationship in at least three ways that I see so far. There may be more to come. The first is that these politics, this exclusionary nationalist discourse, is weakening the consensus in Israel, in Israeli politics, that a strong relationship with the United States is really important. It used to be a truism in Israeli domestic politics that if you wanted to be a viable candidate for prime minister, for national leadership, you had to demonstrate your close ties to the United States, your expertise in managing the relationship with Washington. And if you were an aspiring party leader, one of your very first stops was Washington, D.C., and you wanted those photographs with American political leaders. In fact, people would go through all kinds of machinations to get the images that would be important to their campaigns in Israel. In 1996, when Netanyahu ran for prime minister for the first time, his campaign touted his many appearances on American television as evidence of his mastery of the U.S.-Israel relationship and his ability to be the best person to make Israel's case in the United States. And in 1999, when he was challenged by Ehud Barak, one component of the political argument that Barak made against Netanyahu is that he had mismanaged his relationship with Washington. He and Bill Clinton were at loggerheads, and of course Clinton's own impatience with Netanyahu was all too evident, but it mattered. It mattered in 1999. And 2015, by contrast, Netanyahu's re-election campaign not only deployed these ethno-nationalist themes in mobilizing his voters against the droves of Arabs that were going to the polls, he said, he also ran on his willingness to defy Washington on the Iran deal. His defiance of Washington was a positive, not a negative, and he won a decisive victory. And if you think that the Iran deal was an outlier because it was such an extreme issue, really, as noted earlier, it was a full year before that Bogi Ya'alon found it helpful to his own political prospects in the Likud to call John Kerry an obsessive messianic. And so what we see in Israel's nationalist politics is that Israel is becoming a little bit more like France in terms of its alliance with the United States. They want the closeness, they want the partnership, but there's an asymmetry and they resent it, and so you actually gain points in domestic politics by thumbing your nose at Washington. That's new in Israeli politics, but I don't think it's going away. Now, there's a related trend in American politics that exacerbates this phenomenon in Israel. These things interact with each other, whereby dissent in the relationship has become a good thing instead of a bad thing. And the trend we see in the United States is one that's familiar to all of you. It's this intense polarization in our politics on every imaginable issue, and that's true also of Israel. And what's resulted is a narrowing of the political base of support amongst Americans for the policies of the Israeli government and for US alignment with those policies. So we talk a lot about this in terms of Trump and Netanyahu, and it does have something to do with the fact that we've had 10 years of Netanyahu and 10 years of a right-wing government in Israel. So a very consistent right-wing Israeli policy, but I think that points to the fact that it's really not about Trump and Netanyahu. This is a trend that's been going on for a long time. It's an outgrowth. Trump is an outgrowth of political polarization in the US. So overall support in the United States of Israel, as I said, is very broad. But when it comes to the policies of the Israeli government, and especially the policies that the United States is most involved in, those related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you see in the Gallup polls and in the Pew polls this intense pulling apart. And I have to say that the gap is not just Republicans and Democrats. It's Republicans going hard in one direction and independents and Democrats going in another direction.